My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. So I was just telling you before I hit the record button, I was having breakfast with my wife and son. And I'm bringing this up because he was having a ketogenic breakfast, sausage and egg and so on. And I love talking about diet and nutrition. Mike, I think you and I chatted about this a few times in the past. I'm a very, very big fan of waking up, on the right side of the bed with enough sleep, being able to think clearly. And obviously diet plays a huge role in that. And I was just sitting there with them now, and I was thinking, one of the things that the independent space, I think, lacks a lot in is exactly this kind of dialogue. A lot of it is just very centered around certain topics, and that's okay. But I would love personally to see a much bigger variety of these sorts of talking points that enhance not just the world around us, but our personal lives. I was accused recently of what's the phrase that was used by somebody, flooding the zone. I cover too many topics, but that's for me what makes the puzzle easier to understand. When you have lots and lots of different pieces and you start putting them all together and you start realizing that they're not flooding the zone. All of these things matter in their own way. I'm sure you'll agree with that, right?
Well, I mean, my first comment on that would be people don't have to watch every single episode of Jerm Warfare. I mean, I can understand why they would want to, but they don't have to. So if they feel like the zone's being flooded, turn it off for a couple of days and come back to a topic that. But I'm just going to challenge you a little. So you're claiming that this was a ketogenic breakfast, and then you mentioned the word sausage. Now, I'm going to suggest that depending on what was in that sausage, this could be misinformation. But anyway, look on the topic of diet and so on. The one thing that I have noticed, particularly when we start talking keto versus whatever other particular diet people might be thinking about, is that people get very ideological about it. They get very bought into one thing is the only way, and therefore it becomes very difficult to get any kind of objective truth on this kind of topic. So I don't know how that gets dealt with, but what I find about particularly diet is that the people that are promoting a particular type of diet, well, that may have worked for them. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for everybody, but of course they present it as if it will work for everybody. And so that's where we need to just be a little bit careful, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, when I say ketogenic, I don't mean that from an ideological, I just simply am describing the kind of food that I'm talking about, which is generally low carbohydrate. So in other words, egg and sausage would be obviously high protein, high fat. But you are quite right. I mean, what goes in the sausage does matter. And of course, how it's cooked.
Yes.
But that's not what we're discussing. I'm simply talking about the overarching point of starting off the week with something family orientated and something that's generally nutritious and I think healthy. And I really wish that more people in my extended circles also thought about these things and didn't only wake up thinking about Gaza. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, or I'm not trying to minimize it, but I'm saying that there are many, many facets to the world around us. It's a very big place, and there are a lot of puzzle pieces, and you can't fight battles if you're tired or if you are overweight or you're diabetic or whatever. You got to also get some of those basics right. Priorities.
I think this comes back to a conversation we've had many times, and that is what is it to resist? What is resistance? And it is a multifaceted thing. It is finding every opportunity. And I've mentioned before that whenever the lockdown period was on, one act of resistance was to get out of the house and get away from the computer screen and go for a walk. And I've said before, I would welcome that returning, because it was a motivation that perhaps, there are other priorities again that seem to push that sort of more sort of looking after yourself aspect of life back into the background again, and that really we shouldn't be allowing that to happen.
I mean, that's exactly right. We started off with the walk because we stay on a farm. I think, Charles, you also stay on some sort of farm. I haven't been to your place. I don't know what the layout is, but when it's early morning and it's cold, it's very, very, what's the word? It revitalizes you like immediately, that crispness. It's just, there's something very special about that, which I don't think you really get in the city center.
Well, I suppose it depends where in the city centre. I mean, I think London's a good example. London has huge parks, which are actually really pretty wild. Certainly, if you go, I always used to take great pleasure walking back through Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, sort of in the middle of the night, and you'd always see fox, you'd see owls, you'd see all sorts of wildlife. Is really fascinating. So I think you can experience that. And actually, again, London, swimming in the Serpentine gets pretty cold. So all of this stuff can be done. Plymouth, again, a great example. Swimming in the sea, absolute joy. And people do it, but not very many. And I think there's always something. So yeah, it's easy to say, oh, well, I can't do it because I'm not in the countryside. I don't think that's really true. I think every city I've ever lived in, okay, it's not that many, but enough to know that there is always a way that you can experience that. But no, I think the cold, specifically the early morning air bath, as it's correctly referred to, which is when you spend some time outdoors wearing either nothing at all or just a pair of shorts. And I think that is a very, very good thing to do every day of the year, especially when it's
you
really,
go outside
really cold.
naked.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, come on. I mean, okay, we're now not in the city context.
I was still thinking about the parks in central London.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, people do that, but it's frowned upon a bit more these days than perhaps it was. The exposing yourself to cold, again, okay, this is the what works for you thing, and I would not in any way try to impress this upon anyone who doesn't think that it works for them in the same way that a diet, it's got to work for you. But in my experience and in the people that do similar things experience, exposure to cold air, cold water, has enormous benefit. But yeah, so, but I think also mostly at the start of the day, just the psychological benefit of just, having that interface with the environment, with the elements. It's just, it's exhilarating. So yeah, that's my morning start to the day.
I mean, someone listening to this might go, oh, this is such a shallow conversation. But that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, that it's not. When we talk about resistance, Mike, we are talking about going back to the things that are wholesome, that are good, the things that are not part of all these sort of polywars. The family, I mean, so we had friends over on Saturday, and we were, his wife is pregnant, like my wife is, due around the same time. And he's exhausted. He's absolutely exhausted. And his child hasn't even been born yet. And we were just chatting about how to break that cycle of exhaustion. And when you are like that, you become fairly useless. You don't become, highly functional. And then how can you expect a soldier on the front line to fight any war if he's exhausted? You know what I mean? It always comes back to you being sort of fully charged before you can take on anything else. And I find that so many people get so distracted by so many things. And I think that's by design also. It's like the distraction economy. No,
but this issue of feeling exhausted all the time is an absolutely real thing, and you know, I hear friends and family talking about their work colleagues just constantly being exhausted, or you know, they're constantly off on the sick or whatever it happens to be. This is a combination of you know, people's lifestyles, diets, but it's also the fact that they are generally finding themselves in employment which offers them absolutely nothing in terms of motivation to get up in the morning, or any kind of real sort of sense of achievement or sense of actually doing something useful for society or for themselves. And inevitably these days people are being underpaid for what they're doing, and so as a result, the motivation isn't there. People, you know, this might seem really anecdotal and actually quite silly in some ways, but my observation of life is that, you know, if you need the energy for a particular task, the energy will appear. It's a lot of it's psychological, and actually having the motivation to do the thing that you're intending to do. And if you're getting up in the morning and the only thing you're dying for is time to pass till the Friday night so you can go and have another 6 pints of beer, then what's the point of living? And this is the position that lots and lots of people are finding themselves in. And as a result, they are just constantly feeling exhausted.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, so some of the guests that I've had on my show are remarkably smart. You know, got huge amounts of knowledge, and then I see some of the comments that I get via emails or whatever, or in my Telegram channel or UK column, X forums or whatever. Okay, or the comment section, and there are huge risks of becoming blackballed when you focus only on some of these macro topics, which is why I like to talk about these things that are actually things that we can change, because then it gives you motivation and it's uplifting again. Because when you only focus on the big stuff that you don't have much influence over, you very, very quickly can fall into that cycle of depression and nihilism and not wanting to do anything because, oh, what's the point? And I find that ironically, I find that quite depressing, because then you think, oh, come on, really? We go through all this effort to try and figure things out, to try and resist, and then you become defeatist. And it's exactly what you said there. It is also very psychological.
I think we need to be careful not to be too unfair or hard upon people that do find themselves there, because I think for a lot of people it's not deliberate. And I think we are exactly like with diet, with sleep patterns, with lifestyle, we are as a species, I think, very much out of kilter with our senses. We don't really know what it is we need when we need it, which is why people do get in terrible trouble with particularly diet. But I think what we shouldn't understate is the psychological effect, or rather the stress that is manifested by the psychological pressure of considering that there are elements of your life that are not as you would like them, and that will take its toll. So this, going back to the idea of exhaustion, that can be to do with much more than just, say, a poor diet or not making great choices around sleep. There could be a load of other factors. And I think for people who have got into something of a downward spiral by considering that that the forces that they can't control, so essentially the sort of, let's say, the state and the wider reaching tentacles and all that stuff, if you perceive that you can't control that, there's a feeling of helplessness, and that then can lead into a bit of a downward spiral. But I think in learning about that, I think a lot of people think that they are consciously evaluating that against their own life, against their consciousness. But I don't believe that's really the case. I think there's a lot going on in the subconscious, and there is a way in which the psychological stress takes over, and that, I think, can be a massive they'll have a sort of considerable undoing effect. And to get yourself back up out of that, it is difficult. But to go back to your breakfast, and I think what Mike has been driving at, which we have not actually articulated, is the rusk content in a sausage. And of course it's not necessary. So and I would hope in South Africa you really should be making sausages that have all the right things in them. But the point is, it can be a very, very simple thing to undo. So you make one positive step within the orbit that you do control. So it is up to you what you have for breakfast for most people. Therefore, you make that choice, and that produces the upward spiral because you're regaining control. Then you begin to see the benefits of the choices you've made, and so on and so forth. So it is the simple things that lead to profound changes. But as I say, I think the thing that we mustn't underestimate or belittle is the psychological stress of finding yourself in this position, especially if you're, to an extent isolated, either because you're isolated in your work because your job is doing what it does in the way that Mike describes, or because you have what appear to be ideological differences about the world with those closely around you. And that can be really, really problematic. So if that is combined with the other factors, that's really tricky.
Well, I mean, the point that you make is well made. Peter Bregan, during the COVID years, came onto my show a few times, and he was making the point. I mean, anybody who doesn't know his history, he's probably one of the most prolific, I think, psychiatrists in US history. And he said a number of times that we need to show a sense of sympathy or understanding of people who were getting themselves caught up in, cycles of anxiety and depression because of all these things that have been going on, rather than getting angry and frustrated. But the problem is you do get angry and frustrated when you feel like you're repeating yourself. But that in itself is arrogant also. So it's a horrible kind of balancing act, because I do get frustrated a lot, because you feel like you saying the same thing for year on year on year, and some people just go nah. And what is the reason for that? Why are they not willing to reconsider their position? And that the problem there is that it's a cycle of hubris, because it makes me come off as if I'm superior in my journey. And of course, that's not true, because we all have, we've all got a journey in front of us. I don't really know where I'm going with that.
I'll help you out then, because I think that is. I think that is a sign of, call it what you will, vulnerability, a lack of confidence, weakness. When you're in a position of strength, either physically or mentally, you are absolutely prepared to accept anything in front of you. You can then decide whether or not you want to take it. And, the physical thing would be, right, will you look up a tree or a rock face or whatever, and you think that you can climb it, but you then decide, well, is that going to be the best thing to climb, or do I go round, or whatever it is? So you're in a position of physical strength, and you can decide to do that. And I think mentally, again, if you're in that place mentally where you are confident, you are sure of yourself, then it's not threatening to hear somebody else's point of view. And you can take it and you can evaluate it on its own merits. You can have a sensible discussion with that person, and you can either decide that, yes, it has merit, and you will add it to your learning or to your knowledge, or you will debate it and you can reject it. But I think when you're not in that position of mental stability and feeling that you are in control, then it is very, very damaging, or potentially damaging, to hear anything that might threaten you. That's the way I perceive it, because it looks like somebody else is trying to insert an element of control over your life, which is not, certainly shouldn't be what anyone else tries to do. If you do think that bringing something to somebody's attention is worthwhile, it shouldn't be done in a sort of, you have to know and do this. It's, well, look, this information might help you. That's my reading on it, and I think that's borne out by experience. The people that react badly to stuff are generally not in a position of sufficient control over their own lives, I think.
But just to add to that, Jerm, if you're feeling frustration about some of the responses that you're getting, well, you shouldn't be, because first of all, it's not any of our jobs to tell people what to think. We can only present the information, and that's up to other people to choose what to decide about that. But as well as that, it's easy to be convinced that people are responding in a particular way based on a set of comments that might appear under a video or an article, but those comments are created by the people that are most motivated to comment, and so they're not necessarily the view of the majority of people that have watched the thing, and also
or bots.
Well, that's possible too, but even if we take it on face value and say that this is what people are thinking, those opinions are equally valid. I might not agree with all of them or any of them, but those are what people think. But that doesn't mean that we have to immediately assume that the interview or whatever fell on completely deaf ears or was completely rejected. The vast majority of people, well over 90% of people aren't interested in commenting and just don't comment at all.
Yeah, I'm not really talking about videos as such, though. I think I'm just talking about, discourse in general. Having said that, the upshot is that, a friend of mine is a doctor, and we were chatting about vaccines. Now, he's very much still in the establishment. And he actually said to me, he's been thinking about some of these talking points and what he had studied, and in his own, clinical work, he sees inconsistencies that don't make sense to him, and it's forcing him to look into some of these matters, just on a personal basis. But of course, he has to be careful, because when you do that, you run the risk of being pulled in front of the medical board, kind of thing. But it's great to see that also, and that came about from within himself. Nobody forced him to rethink things or to reconsider. Yeah, you're going to.
There's your key point right there, because that's the only way it can ever happen. You cannot bludgeon people over the head with information and say you will believe this now. That's not how it works. It only ever comes as somebody welcoming that information in, because they're asking questions. If something's happened to them in their own lives that has caused them to ask questions or doubt what they've been told up to that point, and at that point, then they're open to the possibility that somebody else might have a perspective worth listening to. So this is a misunderstanding that many of us hold, that we can and all through the COVID years, when people were out there trying to convince people of why they shouldn't be standing on the street every Thursday evening at 7:30 banging pots together. Those naturally trying to tell people that they are wrong and that you're right, that's never going to fly with anybody. People have to be open to the information, and so we shouldn't be worrying about if something that we've said is being rejected by someone. We should just move on to the next person and see whether they're ready to have a conversation about it or not.
Well, another example of that is we took our little boy to the pediatrician a week ago for the very first time, and the reason why we did that is because he fell on his face off the side of the couch, and we've got a concrete floor, and so he hit himself sort of face first, and so he ended up with this little lump on his lip, and it's fine, but it hasn't gone away because he keeps biting it and playing with it, so it stays there. But it's completely, what's the word? There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a lump on his lip that's in the way. So we took him to the pediatrician to ask if we should have it removed or if it'll go away naturally because it's been there for months. And so he said, okay, hold on. Before we do that, let me go through all my checks. And he did all of these checks that he would normally do on kids. And he said, so has he had any antibiotics? No, he hasn't had any antibiotics. Vaccines? No vaccines. And the more he went through his checks, the more surprised he became. He said, your kid is unbelievably healthy. I can't believe he's never been to a doctor or had antibiotics or anything. And the only issue is this little thing on his lip, and that's that. And he says, I'm really, really impressed. Now that for me that's a great story, because that shows that the puzzle pieces that I've been putting together and my wife have been putting together are fitting. And so that there now suggests to me that I'm on the right path, and so is my wife. You know what I mean? And that there's the upshot. That's the opposite now to the frustrations that I get from talking to other people.
Yes, I mean that is obviously that's very positive in that regard. I mean, the other thing that it does demonstrate is how somebody, a pediatrician who, from the way you describe, would you say it was him or her? Him.
Him, and he's very much in the system.
Okay, but it sounds like he's a nice bloke. He's trying to do the right thing, and he
yes.
he's led a life and a professional career that tells him, that reinforces a belief system that in order to be healthy, you need to have this, that, and the other, and if you get ill, you have antibiotics, and there you go. And so it just it shows how incredibly ingrained that is, to the point where he obviously sincerely believes that if you don't have that, if you're not exposed to pharmaceutical products, especially vaccines, that it would follow that your health would actually deteriorate. It's incredible that people can believe that, when for as long as creatures have been around, until very recently, that was the only way that people could live. So it is remarkable, and again, that's not just to go back to what we were talking about as to whether knowledge can in a way be sort of foisted upon you or forced upon you. This is what is so terribly clever about the mainstream paradigm, because the way that everything is presented it's like a sort of high fence. It's already there in order that you can't look beyond. And you think of, what's the obvious phrase is Russia's full-scale, what is it? The full-scale illegal...
Full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, sorry, I get confused. But that's it. So anyone reading anything about Russia or Ukraine gets whacked in the face with that, and it's not that. So it's sort of passive, because you're reading it, but it absolutely creates that fence that means, right, well, you're never going to consider now that that Russia might not necessarily be X, Y, and Z. Yeah. Anyway, fascinating, interesting exchange, but positive. And let's hope that he would have gone away and had a bit of a think.
But that's what we spoke about in the car after leaving. Why was he surprised? And that's where that frustration can creep in. You're thinking, oh my goodness. All right.
But you see, you're fortunate that he is what he is, because when my kids were young, we were living in France. I don't know what age they were, 3, 4, something like that, and they both got measles, and boy, did we get a serious dressing down by the doctor for not having them vaccinated. That was, we and in other circumstances, I can see that some people would be, would be getting referred to social services, in extreme circumstances for not having their children vaccinated. And so, it's very much a lottery what kind of response you get to these types of issues.
Yeah, it is. I mean, sorry, just the fact, the vaccine logic, the sort of the wrathful indignation of vaccine logic is absolutely mind blowing. Which is that if you've had a vaccination supposedly against a particular thing, and then you get that particular thing, it's fine because you've had the vaccination. So everyone, that's fine then. But if you have not had the vaccination and you get the thing, apparently you get the thing, which is basically so the result is the same. You've got, you get measles or you get whatever it is, and of course in recent times you get the COVID. It's amazing. People have this, there's the path forks in the mind. Either you're absolutely furious with the person because they're ill and they didn't have a vaccine, or you have heartfelt sympathy because they're ill and they did have the vaccine. It's so remarkable that people can think like that. But again,
no one at any point is asked whether the vaccine worked or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
And classic.
But also this brings me back to why I enjoy what I do. And this is why UK Column exists. It's to challenge some of the propaganda and to try and figure out, actually what is true, regardless of ideology. Because the same doctor friend I was chatting to was saying, we were talking about vaccines because his kid's on the way. And he said to me, but the purpose of a vaccine is actually just to reduce the severity of the illness. And my stomach dropped, because that is exactly what propaganda does. Firstly, that wasn't the definition of a vaccine. It changed. It used to be about immunity. Now it's about severity. And that just shows how the system manufactures, unfortunately, the very well-meaning doctors and scientists, etc. But it's so frustrating because you now have to argue, and now you have to challenge him on that point. Now, it's not about severity because they've changed the definition. It's so now you get a vaccine so that you don't get as sick. So my response was, okay, but hold on, wouldn't being healthy actually reduce severity of the disease? He says, well, that's exactly right. He says, and that's a good point. So it comes all the way back to health and diet before worrying about injecting, your child in the arm.
Well, that's the basis of terrain, isn't it? That's the whole point, and it's one of the reasons it's a little frustrating that there's just quite the fight between the vaccine, no vaccine crowd, because at the end of the day, what the evidence absolutely shows is that when you improve terrain, not just externally but internally as well, the outcomes are massively better, and then both sides of that argument can possibly agree that vaccination is not necessary.
But I mean, that's why I get frustrated, because I had a discussion last week with somebody else, and they were talking about, but the vaccine is what you really want to give your child. And I said, but hold on, at what point are we first going to discuss how healthy the child is? Because if you're healthy, by default, you're not unhealthy. I mean, that's generally the binary, right? And of course, it's levels. So the healthier you are, then the less likely you are to be unhealthier, right? That's, I think, pretty obvious. So in order for your child to be healthier, feed your child, better food, and get him outside and get him running around and do all the stuff that would be healthy. What our grandparents told us, rather than focusing on things that are bought in boxes, for them to eat. And it says, with extra added vitamins or whatever, like, you just ignore that stuff and stop worrying about vaccines first. That's the last thing.
You see, there's two, as usual with this kind of conversation, there's two sort of aspects to this. We got this sort of Western first world situation with vaccination. We've also got the global South developing world situation with vaccines, and vaccines in that situation, to my mind, are just another expression of the imperialist brutality that we've seen over several hundred years. So where we're basically saying, particularly in Africa, for example, well, your mineral resources are ours, and therefore we will keep you in abject poverty, barely able to feed yourselves, certainly not able to have a healthy environment. We'll make sure that your water maintains a certain level of danger and so on. But don't worry, we'll come along and we will vaccinate you, and that will solve all these problems that we refuse to allow you to deal with. So, we maintain countries at a level of poverty that guarantees that the terrain they're having to exist in is basically unhealthy. And then we come in with the pharmaceuticals, which first world taxpayers are paying for, and we vaccinate the hell out of everybody. I'm not sure how that isn't just adding insult to injury.
And it also is economically ineffective. I mean, Pfizer and Moderna, etc., these are not movements. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations that don't give these things out for free. Somebody's paying for them, and that's coming from the taxpayers. And across the African continent, where there's a lot of poverty, you're making everybody poorer by using their money to pay for these things.
Yeah, but it's our money too. It's not just their money, because their money, they don't have enough money to make any major difference to the corporate profits of Pfizer and Moderna and these types of companies. This is our taxpayer money, which is being used to brutalize these people, and that makes it our problem as well.
Yeah, you're correct. You're correct.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if Bill Gates says, well, we're going to go same thing. We're going to go and distribute this at no cost to the Africans, right? That's coming from somewhere. That money is coming from somewhere. And he does that, by the way, not just Gavi, but other organizations. They'll come and say, well, we care about the Africans, so we're not going to charge them. But somebody's being charged, Mike.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no such thing as a free lunch.
No, there isn't. I went to I think I may have mentioned this before, either the largest or one of the largest syringe manufacturers in Africa a couple of years ago, Revital, just north of Mombasa in Kenya. And it was absolutely fascinating because, again, exactly like your pediatrician, it was a family firm. They'd been going for years. I mean, it was a very, very well run business, and from a manufacturing point of view, it was fascinating to watch. It was very, very well done. And actually, also interestingly, they had covered all of their warehouses and factory buildings in solar panels. And so I asked about that. Said, "Oh right, so what is this? Anything to do with net zero, climate change?" And he just laughed and said, "Don't be ridiculous. We're in Kenya. There's no power. We need our own power." And and so they sorted it out, and they had their own supply of power. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. What was so fascinating though was that, like your pediatrician, completely well intentioned, they thought that they were part of a wider operation that enabled healthcare across the continent. And it was only when we got on to the COVID jab that there was a sort of a glitch in the conversation, because it was totally fascinating. The young chap I spoke to, who was very, very nice and very open, did absolutely talk about friends of his that he knew had been harmed by the jab. Because my question was, so what? Not really so much in liability, but it just in terms of your thoughts on the matter. What happens if your products, your syringes, are used for a drug that subsequently turns out to be very harmful? That was the line of the conversation. And he did, of course, speak about the COVID jab having harmed friends. So it was a very odd thing to listen to from somebody who is completely facilitating all that. But exactly like you say, the money side of it, and when you talk about Bill Gates or whoever it is pushing this stuff out. This was exactly what they were at the front end of doing, coordinating teams in partnership with the government in order that they would go out into the regions and they would start to, diagnose people who've never seen a medic before with something that they didn't know they had, brackets, they don't have, close brackets, and then to say, oh, this will finish you off, but don't worry, I've got just the drug, and that's how it starts. And so, yes, you're right that these people are not paying in the first instance, but it's absolutely bringing them into a system where if they do ever generate income, they will absolutely be paying for it, and otherwise we are, of course, paying for it. But it's very disturbing, and I think with modern communications being what they are and the ability to digitize and keep records in a way that wasn't previously possible, and this runs alongside the push for identity and all that kind of thing. Again, the line is because it's empowering, because otherwise your life is not worth anything if you can't demonstrate who you are. And you think, well, why do you actually, if you've lived for generations without needing to do that, why do you need to do it? So yeah, it is very much happening, and there is a huge amount of money involved, but as you say, not their money, but our money.
Having said that, and I don't know if I've told you this particular story. I have spoken about this a couple of times on my show over the years, but about 20 minutes away from my house, during COVID, they built a huge, absolutely massive pharmaceutical manufacturing warehouse or something. I don't quite know exactly what it was because they didn't label it, but how I knew it was that is because the mayor went and they had that that big opening ceremony with a ribbon, and he cut it with those big scissors and all that sort of nonsense. And then he made a talk about we're bringing COVID vaccines cheaply to our people of South Africa. As you know, South Africans overwhelmingly rejected the vaccine, and I think the uptake was like less than 1%. It was very, very low. Well, within, I think, a year, that entire building had been sold off, and now it's being used for something else. A multi-million US dollar operation that just fell because the people just said, nah, not interested. And that's one of the things I love about living here. And I think this extends across, sub-Saharan Africa. There's a very healthy suspicion and skepticism towards authority structures. And I think in the West, or shall I say first world countries, I guess they're kind of interlinked, but generally there's a lot more compliance. In countries, I suppose, like your own, and I don't mean that in a horrible way, but I think people generally are more compliant and less sort of middle finger. And I'm not quite sure why it is like that. Perhaps it's just historical. I don't know. But it's just a story that you reminded me now to tell you about.
Well, I don't. Charles can maybe answer this better than I can. I don't know. I haven't been to Africa at all in my life, unfortunately, to date. So I can't really say what kind of.
Oh no, we've got
what
to
it's
change
like
that,
to live
Mike.
in many of these countries. But you see, South Africa though isn't. I'm not sure that is quite the same thing
as Uganda,
maybe yeah, or
Kenya.
Yeah, no, but I'm just thinking, how much because of the nature of living in a so-called first world country where we're just constantly bombarded with media and so on. The psychological impact of that is much stronger, and also the fact that we are subject to a jurisprudence system that with the idea that we have abandoned the idea of innocent until proven guilty for so many so-called smaller offences like driving offences and so on, that we have been beaten into submission in many ways.
I think so.
I suspect that I suspect that many African countries or developing so-called developing nations are not subject to that same kind of psychological control.
But I think it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. They each come at their own cost, so without getting sidetracked. But I mean, for example, perhaps in the UK or in Canada, or whatever, there's a much better infrastructural network of everything, in terms of reliability, things working, etc., etc. The cost of what I'm talking about is generally, if you have a healthy suspicion of the state, it's probably because the state is remarkably corrupt and broken and inept and useless. And that comes at further costs, like you have broken infrastructure and things that don't work.
I don't think that's quite because I think if you ask the average person in the UK what they think of the state, they would probably say exactly those things. So I don't think it's quite that. Because even though there's a recognition that the state is utterly broken and corrupt and so on, still there's a high degree of compliance because of the way that the state interacts with individuals and it slaps fines on them and for misbehavior and so on. We're talking about a social credit system. It's absolutely here, and people behave in a particular way as a response to that, and that kind of infrastructure, I suspect, is not the same on the African continent.
That's an interesting point because, at the risk of mentioning China again, which I often do, but there you have a very compliant society, but you actually have a state that appears to work very effectively for the people, if that makes sense. I mean, the cops don't even have guns. They don't need to. Whereas here they do. They are heavily armed here because people really don't respect authority here. So they kind of have to get almost physically beaten into submission on a daily basis. It's a bit more Wild West here than what it is there. So I'm wondering if there's a cultural aspect to this also. I don't know. I'm just asking. I don't know the answer. I've thought about this a lot, and I have I don't even have a remotely close conclusion to what could be an answer.
It's an interesting one. I think it's quite chicken and egg on the cultural front with regard to violence. I mean, I think one way in the United Kingdom, for example, we do have armed police. Not very many, and typically they don't do anything with their firearms. So they, on average, 18. Hang on, let me get this right. About 6,000 firearms officers in the United Kingdom, on average, will discharge about 10 rounds in. When I say in anger, I'm afraid to say I think some of those are even accidental or negligent discharges. But either way, in the line of duty, about 10 rounds a year are discharged, and so therefore they're basically pointless. However,
what did you say? Did you say 10 rounds?
10 rounds, yeah. So the statistics are amazing. There are 6,000 firearms officers who have about 18,000 firearms deployments per year. So basically, if you were a firearms officer, then on average, you would be deployed 3 times a year in the whole of the year to what's described as a firearms incident. So it becomes a firearms incident where there either is a firearm involved or reckoned to be involved, or the level of violence is such that you think, all right, you need a firearms presence. Otherwise, they're just filling in, doing all sorts of other stuff. And over the course of 18,000 incidents that they respond to, about 10 rounds are discharged. Yeah. So yes, as I say, statistically pointless, but in the instances where they have shot at or shot somebody, the response to that is, the one that springs to mind was London. I forget his first name, Duggan, and there was tremendous violence as a result of that. So therefore, my point is that if police went around the place, blatting more rounds off and shooting more people, then I think it would follow that the population would become more violent. I think that's an upward spiral. How you downward that spiral, no one seems to have quite worked out. But so that I would say is one thing. I think on why Africa appears to be different, I do think, yes, I think culture might have something to do with it, but then again, that's a little bit nebulous.
I mean, it's a huge continent, so
it
there
is
are
huge
multiple
continent.
cultures.
Exactly, yeah. So to pin that down is tricky. However, I think there are two things. I think there is a totally well-founded suspicion of the outsider. So I would say that the state does fall into that. You know, these great big fat men in their huge great cars are quite clearly outsiders. They're not. Some of them will pretend to be from whichever tribe. It's quite clear that they're not. They don't really share any identity. You could say the same in the West as well, but I think the difference there is more stark. And by outsider, I mean I do also mean the white man. I don't mean the race element, but just the difference. It's somebody who's very obviously different, and therefore mistrust is the default. And I think that's served people well over time. And then the other one, exactly like Mike says, in fact, is the technical infrastructure. And just to substantiate this with an anecdote, okay, silly, but I was pulled over once on, I think it was the Nairobi-Mombasa road in Kenya, apparently for speeding. And the guy, he had his little hairdryer speed gun thing, and he walked up to me, to my window, and showed me, I kid you not, a children's exercise book, so a paper exercise book with my speed written down in it in a column, and that was his evidence. So it didn't the gun hadn't actually recorded. I mean, he couldn't show me on the gun that I'd gone that fast. So I simply said, well, you know, that looks great, and if my car did go that fast, I'd be delighted, but unfortunately it doesn't. So we had a huge laugh about it, and on I went. Basically what I was actually saying was, I'm definitely not going to pay you a bribe, and I know that all you've got is an exercise book, so I think we're done here, aren't we? So we parted friends, because he knew that I'd called his bluff, and that was it. But here, certainly in the United Kingdom, tediously for everybody concerned, we are several steps beyond that. We do have ANPR and recording. You know, we do have an audit trail for all this stuff, which means that the paperwork, you know, it is there, and then it is linked to this, that, and the other. And it's, you know, going back to the social credit thing. So if you do decide, right, well, yeah, okay, I've had a letter through about speeding, but I'm not going to do anything about it. The problem with that is that there may be a consequence that does in fact have an impact on your life in a way that I think in lots of places where there isn't that degree of technocracy, the consequences are not yet the same. So I mean, obviously the fear for Africans or, you know, people that are not yet under this kind of a yoke is that situation will develop because technology continues to pervade. So that, I would say, those are the sort of more straightforward reasons for it, I think.
Yes, I mean, there's a very interesting talking point there, which we can have on a different day, because I think there's an entire discussion that one can have about the chronology of a society's growth running in parallel with technological growth. Let me try and explain that. So South Africa, for example, and like many sub-Saharan African countries, have very broken infrastructure, and when it's working, it's only working in little areas here and there. But technology kind of circumvents that, if that makes sense. So we've got a very, very intricate tech sector in South Africa, and it's quite advanced. We don't need trains and decent roads and all that kind of stuff for the tech to work, because the tech goes, you know, through the airwaves. And there's a very interesting dynamic that occurs as a result. I mean, I think every South African has got a cell phone. You know what I mean? They can access YouTube, but they might not be able to take a train. So I don't know what that means for the future, but it certainly can tie into technocracy that you just mentioned.
Well, what it means for the whole of Africa is that it's being used as a pilot scheme for many of the digital money systems that are eventually going to be rolled out in other countries, and that's problematic.
It's definitely problematic because somehow the technology leapfrogged infrastructural development. So, like I said, it's not chronological. We're not behind in everything. We are on par with other things, and it's just a very strange dichotomy to witness, because the president of South Africa just 2 weeks ago announced that the government is now discussing the development of infrastructure for digital ID. He said this on TV. So there it is. It's now open, and it is coming. But I don't know how it will occur because of the broken infrastructure. And I don't know how the uptake will be. But it'll be interesting to observe in the coming years. But that's not that far behind. What's going on in perhaps the UK or the US.
Yeah, and I think it's enormously regrettable that can be done without then needing to be any of the other things that you mention. And I think this has happened across the board. We are in a mess. I mean, infrastructure, I think even in many supposedly developed or civilized countries or advanced or however you want to say it, there aren't that many where everything works, I would say. Certainly in Western Europe, I think, again, United Kingdom is an absolutely brilliant example. Having set up I think it's fair to say, a very good system of transport, both for passengers and freight, via canals, via railways, and then roads, that the whole thing has become completely out of kilter because you've had developments, I think roads in particular, and then too many cars not repairing the roads, taking away many of the railways, doing crazy things with flights and airports. And now the result is that the entire thing is a complete mess. And so with that being the case, I don't think it should follow that you should be able to plonk a sort of digital architecture over the top of it and say, yeah, there you go, that all works. To me, that would only follow if everything else was in place and running as it's supposed to, because the problem is that when you do put the digital layer in, then the rest of it just gets forgotten about. Doesn't, there's no need for it to be pulled up to sort of meet that in effect, and I think everybody suffers doubly because of it. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is there with the sort of hard infrastructure.
And I will say this, that a lot of this digital infrastructure that is being built here in South Africa is not Chinese. That's going to upset a few folks, because apparently I'm a China maxer, but it appears that that a lot of this tech is not coming from the East. It is coming from Western fintech.
Yes, and in terms of the digital ID rollout in Africa, Jerm, the unfortunate thing is that a lot of payments in Africa right across the continent are digital only. And of course, if you simply then say to somebody, well, you can't make payments anymore unless you also have this extra layer in place, then that guarantees the rollout because currency is difficult.
Mm. And SWIFT is not Chinese or Asian. I think SWIFT is Western, isn't it?
No, it is. That's why that's part of the justification for Russia and China to go their own way with clearing systems, and that's certainly been part of the drive for them to implement some kind of CBDC of their own at a so-called wholesale level in order to try to manage some of these international payments.
By the way, CBDC is a term that we apparently shouldn't be using anymore. I don't know if Catherine Austin Fitz has made this clear enough, but she's been making the argument now that the language is changing because it's not only CBDCs that are programmable. So she says we must say programmable money because it covers a broader spectrum. Just thought I'd throw that in.
I think that's a very valid point, and particularly in the United States at the moment, where the Federal Reserve has been banned from pursuing CBDC for 10 years or whatever it is, because Trump wants to create this privatized equivalent, and so it shouldn't really matter whether it's but it's the same thing, Jerm. So it doesn't really make any difference whether it's coming from a effectively privatized central banking system or private corporations. It's the same kind of thing. So I think your point's absolutely valid.
All right. I see time's against us, and we had a very stream of consciousness banter session, which of course is my favorite. I like that. We covered a lot of ground and also in many respects no ground. But gentlemen, thank you so much. I'll catch up with you next week. My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.